Good morning, class. Today, we're going to dive into an important concept in biology called reproductive isolation mechanisms. But before we start, let's think about something. What happens if two different species try to mate? Can they produce offspring together? Well, in most cases, they can't. That's where reproductive isolation comes in. It's what prevents different species from interbreeding, even if they live in the same environment. First, let's look at prezygotic isolation. This occurs before fertilization, when sperm and egg never get the chance to meet. Prezygotic mechanisms are all about barriers that keep species from even attempting to mate. There are several types of prezygotic isolation mechanisms, which we can break down into 5 categories. First is the temporal isolation. This is when two species reproduce at different times. For example, in some species of frogs, one might breed early in the spring, while another breeds later in the summer. So they're not active at the same time to mate. Next is behavioral isolation. Different species have different mating behaviors or rituals. Think about birds with elaborate courtship dances or songs. If a bird species sings a different song or performs a different dance, the other species might not recognize the behavior as a sign of courtship, and they won't mate. The third one is mechanical isolation. Sometimes species just can't mate because their physical structures are incompatible. For example, let's look at a giraffe and a horse. A giraffe is much taller with a long neck, while a horse is shorter with a different body shape. These physical differences would make it impossible for them to mate, even if they were in the same area. The genitalia of the male giraffe is too large for the horse's genitalia. If the male giraffe manages to insert it, it could cause the death of the female horse. The female horse's organs could be damaged if it is inserted. Another example is Bradybina. They are both Bradybina, but their shells spiral differently, meaning their shells are incompatible. Because of this, their genitals are also incompatible, so they cannot mate because their genitals won't fit. Next is gamete isolation. Even if sperm from one species reaches the egg of another, sometimes they can't interact properly due to chemical differences. For example, humans and chimpanzees are closely related, but sperm and eggs from humans and chimpanzees can't combine to make babies because of chromosome differences. Humans have 46 chromosomes, while chimpanzees have 48, because their chromosomes don't match up properly. Even if human sperm reached a chimpanzee egg, fertilization wouldn't happen. The sperm and egg can't work together to create an embryo because their genetic information doesn't align properly. The last one is ecological isolation. Species can also be isolated by their habitats. For example, two species of frogs might live in the same general area, but one might live in forests while the other lives in ponds. This frog prefers in the ponds to mate while this frog's in the forest. As a result, they remain separated species. Another example of this is the mountain bluebird lives at a higher elevation, while the eastern bluebird prefers lower elevations. Even though they are in the same region or place, they cannot mate because mountain bluebirds prefer higher elevations and eastern bluebirds prefer lower elevations. Now let's talk about a postzygotic isolation. This occurs after fertilization has happened. Even if sperm and egg combine to form a zygote, postzygotic mechanisms prevent the hybrid offspring from thriving or reproducing. Reproductive isolation is crucial for speciation, the process through which new species are formed. It can occur through a variety of prezygotic or postzygotic mechanisms that prevent interbreeding between species. Over time, as isolation continues, populations diverge genetically, eventually leading to the formation of new species. Without reproductive isolation, speciation wouldn't happen. Hybrid sterility. Hybrid sterility happens when two different species mate, but their baby cannot have babies of its own. This happens because their genetics don't work together properly. For example, is the mule, which is the baby of a donkey and a horse. Mules are sterile because donkeys have 62 chromosomes, horses have 64, and mules end up with 63, making it impossible for them to reproduce. F to fitness. It means the hybrid will still have offspring, but the offspring of the hybrid will be infertile. In other words, the hybrid's child will no longer be able to reproduce or will become sterile. For example, a hinny is the hybrid offspring of a female donkey and a male horse. Hinnies are generally sterile, meaning they cannot reproduce. If hinnies were to have an F2 generation, those offspring would be infertile or not survive well. This inability to reproduce or thrive reinforces the reproductive isolation between donkeys and horses, preventing the two species from merging. Zygomortality. Zygomortality happens right after two species mate. When the sperm and egg come together, the zygote, the first cell, might not survive. This happens because the genes from the two species don't work well together. The fertilized egg doesn't develop properly, and the baby doesn't even get a chance to grow. For example, a horse and a zebra can mate, but sometimes the fertilized egg dies early because the horse and zebra's genes don't match up well. Reproductive isolation is crucial for speciation, the process through which new species are formed. It can occur through a variety of prezygotic or postzygotic mechanisms that prevent interbreeding between species. Over time, as isolation continues, populations diverge genetically, eventually leading to the formation of new species. Without reproductive isolation, speciation wouldn't happen.